This is Shiting welcoming you to Backstage, the life behind the music. This is an online series of conversations with pianists, an exploration of their remarkable artistic lives as performers, teachers, and advocates for music. Through talking, I hope to shed some light on their process, to get a glimpse into some of their music making, the real work that takes place before they or their students step out onto the stage. Okay, before we start, I have a quick question. So I did read an article that you wrote in response to the article Beethoven. Why do we still play Beethoven? He's dead. Can we move on now? That I
Yes.
thought that was very interesting. And can I ask you to talk a little bit about that?
No, that's fine. And first of all, it's nice to see you. And I don't know if you remember that you had a lesson with me in Chengdu
Yes, I did.
many years ago.
Yes.
We both moved on to bigger and better things.
Yes.
Uh, yes, that is a very good question, and it's a very pertinent question these days because there's a good question about why do we play old music.
Hmm.
Um, and why Beethoven in particular, but why do we play European music, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I think those are valid questions these days. And I'm going to address it a little bit because it's kind of being asked here at Oberlin, and I
Hmm.
think in general about enlarging the canon, as they say. Um, and I am very interested by this trend and also by the idea that there's great music being written in all sorts of different places and by different people, and that we should investigate that. What I was trying to say in that my response was that it doesn't have to be an either or situation
Hmm.
where you have to stop playing old music because you have to play new music, etc. Um, and so my point was, first of all, not to deify Beethoven or any of our great composers. They were human beings. They were part of their history. Um, they were part of a tradition that was mostly male.
Hmm.
And, you can't retroactively correct that, except by thinking about how to handle this situation now. Uh, but, the whole idea of greatness or genius or even masterpiece um, is uh, something that we need to think about. Um, in my view, I think there's good music and there's bad music, and we need to be able to find it wherever it is. But we do need to, these days, enlarge our interest in looking at women composers or minority composers and so on. But my big point was that you don't have to abandon the past in order to embrace the present.
Hmm. You're so devoted to the music of Beethoven. I was wondering if you could tell us how did your interest start and what kept you going all these years?
Uh, yes, of course, he's very central to me. Um, I played Beethoven since I was maybe 6 years old, sonatinas and that kind of thing. Um, and it always spoke to me in a special way, not solely Beethoven. I mean, I played all sorts of music. But there are parts of his personality and of his kind of approach to creativity that always inspired me. Um, I find that constant striving for new ways to express himself and also kind of discontent with the standards of style that he inherited from the great masters. Um, I it's very stimulating for me to find that progression throughout his life. And the personal story is very moving. Of the composer who can't hear, a kind of disability type issue, and his response to it. And that kind of reminds me of something I wanted to mention and not to forget is that my wonderful, great teacher, Leon Fleischer, passed away uh, quite recently. And it was a very important moment, to have your mentor not be there anymore. but he also encountered a lot of adversity. So, response to adversity, how do you adjust to difficulties in your life? Some people kind of crumble, but some people are able to go through it and actually use the disability as a kind of way of looking deeper into uh, one's art and one's work. Um, I remember a moment. I was a young immigrant boy. We went from Bucharest, where I was born, to Paris in my early teens, and then we came to America. And I was practicing at somebody's house, and there was a Waldstein sonata on the piano rack. And I didn't know the Waldstein. I looked at it and I said, "Oh, it's a really great piece. I hope someday that I'll be able to play it." And it's kind of significant because that was 1961, long ago. And 50 years later, I released my recording of all the sonatas. So in 2011, so that's kind of a lifespan there.
What was the process like when you were recording all the sonatas? Did it take months, years to finish the whole recording of it?
The first thing that happened is that I played the cycle in Oberlin in 8 recitals, and that was over 2 years. So there was 4 and 4, 1998, 99. And then I was very fortunate to get something that they call here a research status grant, which gives you a year off with pay. So I took that year to start the recording in 2001. Basically, I did 2 CDs per year for about 5 years. Because during the year I couldn't really do it, but I did it in the summers. And I found a wonderful Bösendorfer piano, by the way, that for some reason was ideal for playing Beethoven. Wonderful control of dynamics, fantastic pedals, unbelievable clarities. It's a kind of a Viennese piano, so that was an inspiration. So basically, it took me 5 years to complete the project. And I learned a lot along the way. I had not done a lot of recording before that, some incidental kinds of things, some contemporary music. So one thing I learned was how to be very consistent, because you're doing different kind of takes, and you have to be able to maintain tempo and maintain continuity even though things are fragmented. So it makes you a better musician, I think, the whole practice of recording. And the other thing I learned just personally was that you can take risks when you're recording, because you can always go back and do it over. So at first I was so petrified of the microphones. They're extremely unforgiving. But after a while I said, I'm going to go for it. And if it doesn't work, then we'll do it again, kind of thing. And usually there were moments when you get to an impasse where you're playing something over and over, it just gets worse and worse. And your producer is a very important part of the process, because he has to be your psychologist and your daddy. He has to kind of say, "Okay, Peter, we're going to start from the back. We're going to do these 11 bars that you need, just take your time," and so on. So he was a very a good manager of my anxieties and so on. And then, of course, the whole editing process is, I found it extremely exciting. I mean, some people think about recording live being the only way to do it because it's spontaneous and so on. But I think the editing processes can be very creative. And my company that recorded me was located in Boston. So they would send me a first edit, and I would make some comments on that, and they would have a second edit. Then I flew to Boston, and we sat around in the editing room, and we just went through different takes and said, "Do we have a better option over here?" And it's kind of like magic, when you put it all together. By the end of the evening, we had like a movement that was pretty ideal, and they let me stay in the audio room, and they said, "Okay, Peter, you can just listen." And it was kind of blissful. So editing is kind of like writing a novel, right? I mean, you have a first draft, you have a second draft, you have a third draft, you have editors that tell you this and that. And so I don't think there's any kind of moral issue. You're trying to create as close to an ideal version at that moment that you can. So, extremely intense, uh, incredibly challenging, and ultimately unbelievably satisfying to do this project.
That sounds like such a memorable, lifelong memory to remember.
Absolutely, and it's a kind of something that you can look back and say, uh, I recorded the complete Beethoven Sonata, so it's a kind of a platform to stand on, whatever else happens in your life.
You have talked about dilemmas in reading the score of Beethoven's music. What are some your own dilemmas when teaching or performing Beethoven's music? How do you strike balance between discipline, control, and freedom?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, there are a number of issues in all of interpretation, because we are reproducers of somebody else's work. And the first thing that I care about is really good editions. And I have one on my piano here that I wanted to promote because it just came out. It's the new Bärenreiter edition of the Beethoven Sonatas. And in case you're interested, the violin sonatas just came out in Bärenreiter. So to me, that's like being a little kid in a toy store, It's just, exciting. So this is fantastic. It has no fingerings in it, which I really appreciate. I don't like somebody else's fingerings. And it's got copious notes. In fact, the notes are a separate volume. It says commentaries, right?
Yes.
So that's all of the small print that we all should pay attention to. So that's number one, is starting with a good, fantastic edition. There's also other things, like this one is not by Beethoven, but it's by Chopin. It just happens to be near my piano. That's Chopin's handwriting of the Etude in E major. But, I happen to have all of the photocopies of all the Beethoven manuscripts. And so it doesn't end with what we now call urtext. You kind of have to be Sherlock Holmes, I tell my students. You have to look at different possibilities, different versions. Sometimes Beethoven changed his mind and he would send something to the publisher. And then you kind of have to look at it and say, why did he change his mind? Why didn't he like the first version? Why did he make those choices? So it's a very dynamic intellectual activity, interpreting the score, right? I have a particular issue with slavish obedience to the score. I mean, I respect the score, and I look into it with absolute meticulousness, but it's only a blueprint. You have to flesh it out. It's like looking at a sketch of something and trying to see the whole picture. So there's, like, you're asking me about dilemmas, and I like to talk about that because there are some things that you just have to decide. For example, in Beethoven, there's a question of registers. His early pianos were small. They went from here to usually here. So it's 1, 2, 3. They had basically a 5-octave piano. So being who he was, he didn't like limitations like that. He really felt like he was being constrained. So many times you see him struggling against the upper edge or against the lower edge of his piano. And every time his piano became larger, which was an amazing development throughout his life, he would immediately use the extra available notes. So I kind of figure, like, I'm trying to think from this sonata. I think in that little lecture I gave, there's one place where he really wants to go to an F sharp, but he doesn't have it. So he has to kind of make some kind of adjustments that he's not very happy about it. He plays instead of, So the decisions for us as players is, should I play the F sharp or not? You know, and there are people who would say, no, no, don't do it because, you know, it's printed the way it is. But of course, then you look at the recapitulation, which is lower. And of course, he goes upwards, you know. So that's one kind of decision you have to make. What are some other things, some kind of dilemmas? There's the usual, you know, first note of the first sonata that I talk about. It's, the very first note, the upbeat C, does not have a staccato on it. I'm not going to go into great detail with this because it could take us all day. But, you know, there's no staccato on the upbeat. So it's, what did he want, you know? And then when the left hand plays, there's a staccato down there, but not up here. So there are some people who think it should be a slurred upbeat because there's no staccato. Some people think it should be kind of a longer note, which to me is really stupid, I'm sorry to say. So basically, it's just an upbeat and it's a light note, and you should just play it short, you know. But it's not there, and also in the development, the E flat doesn't have a staccato, so it happens twice. So then you have to think about it. Is this some kind of idea that he had? I just think it's like assumed that an upbeat is going to be a light note. So, but it's not there. So it's a moral decision. What do you do with the score? Yeah, I want to show you one place where the register issue is actually becomes a creative moment for him, like in the Tempest Sonata. It's he goes upwards in octaves, which is great. When it happens later, it happens in D minor, the key of the piece. But he cannot go in octaves because his piano stops at F. So you could play it in octaves, which would be symmetrical. But instead of that, he just stops on D. And and it's so exciting because so instead of going upwards and getting stuck on F or something, he just keeps pounding that D, and it becomes a very chromatic, dissonant moment. So in cases like that, I would never think about, you know, playing the upper register because it's so exciting. The way he dealt with a limitation and make it into a powerful statement. So that's some of the issues. You know, I spend a lot of time comparing expositions to recapitulations to see if there are differences and why. You know, he was a master of variations, so there were often small changes. Sometimes they seem like maybe it's being absent-minded, like a slur is a little bit, you know, those are details. I don't think it matters too much. There's a famous one in the Hammerklavier with the A natural versus A sharp, where the transition to the recap, I think it's like so he's working his way up chromatically, but he forgot to put a natural on the A. So it's a the A sharp is in the key signature, and some people think that that's genius, but I don't think so. He goes from an A sharp to a B flat, so I think he just forgot the natural. So there's two schools, you know, A natural or A sharp. And I had the chance to talk to Mr. Badura Skoda, who's passed away recently also, and he's in the A natural school, so I'm in good company.
You're definitely an example of real scholar slash pianist. Do you think pianists should also be scholars? What is the relationship between scholarly inquiry and musical intuition?
Another wonderful question, Shitin. That's really great. I think musicians should be cultured people. Um, I'm not sure, I'm not a musicologist and I'm not a theorist, but I think I know enough to inform what I'm doing. Um, Being born in Europe and playing European music, I know pretty well about European history. And to me, I think it makes a difference if you know the historical circumstances. This music didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a context. And so the way I've kind of developed as a musician is to study what I needed to study in order to make an intelligent decision about interpretation. So, of course, I'm very partial to the little print in the scores, where they mention the different sources and so on. So, yes, I think musicians should be cultured, intelligent, intellectual people. And, to put a little plug for my employer, I think Oberlin's a good place for that, because we have a wonderful college here that has great sort of intellectual exchange. And so I always encourage my students to take courses in art history, in world history, literature, um, you know, theater, and so on, because it makes you just a much more complex interpreter of music. So I definitely feel that. Let me give you one small example of a piece that I love. It's the Polonaise Fantasy by Chopin. It's a very late work, Opus 61. And it's a Polonaise and it's a fantasy. So I have a kind of a story in my mind. Um, of a longing for the homeland, where he's trying to be. He starts with a kind of polonaise, and then it sort of meanders into some kind of longing or searching for something. And so Chopin's personal history as a Polish born composer who lived in Paris and a longing for his birthplace. To me, when I play that piece, I just feel very moved. And of course, I'm also an expatriate, as are you. So does it help to know Polish history about the strife of being occupied by the Russians and so on? I don't know about the details of it, but just that psychological place where Chopin was, to me, makes that a more profound interpretation.
Yeah, that's very moving. Um, in addition to being a great scholar, great pianist, you're also a great teacher. I was wondering if you could talk to us about some of the most important things in your teaching. What are some of the things you try to impart on your students?
Yes, of course, I've been teaching for a long time now, and I think I've evolved over time. Um, a couple of major issues for me are the kind of teaching that is humiliating or shaming, which is a kind of a school out there, of, if the student is not crying at the end of the lesson, then it's not a good lesson. And some students want that kind of treatment. They say, he or she are being really tough on me, but they made me a better musician and so on. I like to think of it more like a collaboration, where obviously in some ways I am wiser and older than my students, but they are sincere musicians and they're hardworking, also they're human beings, So I don't believe in being a martinet or a disciplinarian as such. I'm hoping that the work that we do is so stimulating and exciting and searching for some kind of truth that I don't need to, sometimes maybe you do need to correct somebody or whatever. Um, Let me see, I made some points here. Um, one thing that I really am concerned about is just, nuts and bolts of pianist injuries. So my approach to technique is, I call it piano ergonomics, where, you know, it's a question of how this complicated mechanism here relates to this really complicated mechanism here. You know, we've got 10 fingers, different length, and we got all these black and white notes and so on. And I think that approaches to technique in general can be harmful. You were raised in a Chinese upbringing, right? And I don't know what your teacher's approach was, but occasionally I find it a little bit too muscular and too, you know, maybe something like, you can't see my hand, you know, high fingers and, you know, kind of curved and so on. And it affects tone production and it affects, you know, your tendons and all that kind of thing. So I try to use very natural forces for piano playing. For example, gravity, like, you know, it's hard to see the keyboard. How to use, you know, I mean, my arm is kind of heavy, and how to use the natural weight of the arm to produce tone instead of trying to squeeze the piano or to attack the piano and so on. I find that very useful. So piano ergonomics, I'm not going to go into detail. The other thing that I'm very interested in, and I think you are too, is in stylistic authenticity. So, you know, I usually ask my students to take some lessons in forte piano, maybe even harpsichord. I don't go to the organ so much, but I suppose that's also helpful to try to understand the original approach to sound in the early instruments. And I, you know, generally find a lot of, for example, Mozart playing to be on the heavy side, over pedaled, maybe approaches to tempo. You know, sometimes, you know, like adagio for us could mean something different than for Mozart. You know, adagio for us is like Bruckner, right? And, you know, for Mozart, adagio was a, you know, a flowing tempo, beautiful sostenuto and so on. So you have to kind of work your way back to the original meaning of things and so on. What else? You know, there's something about what Mr. Fleischer taught me, which probably comes from Schnabel. It's a question of taste, you know, approaches to rubato and to just expression in general. You know, some of it has to do with some schools of acting. Like one thing I do with my students is we listen to various monologues of to be or not to be, Shakespeare. And, you know, the range of expression from something, you know, like I always go to Laurence Olivier because he's like a paragon of Shakespeare for me. And he takes a very bland, pale approach to be or not to be. It's very doubtful. It's very hesitant to be or not to be. And then others who say, to be or not to be, that is the question. Where do you find the range of emotional expression? And in general, I would say it's better to do less than more, you know, not to overdo, to find a tasteful, you know, a deep but tasteful approach to expression. So that's usually a lot of searching for, you know, the different personalities too. Some people are more emotional, let's say spontaneous, others are more analytical, cerebral, and so on. So those, you know, I mean, over the years, you know, you just kind of, you see all kinds of types of students, and you sort of have to adjust your approach, you know, to their own individual personality and so on. But I find it, you know, they progress well, and asking the right questions makes them thinking musicians, which is very gratifying for me.
One thing I'm always interested to ask is, what are some of the most inspiring musical experience you've ever had in your career, whether it's someone else's performance or your own performance or your teaching experience? What can you think of?
Yes, of course, I grew up in Bucharest, Romania, which is sort of I would call it an outpost of Austro-Hungary. So I'm a Central European at heart, which I am very grateful for because I think it's a hotbed of musical culture and beauty. Uh, this is a story that my mother told me, but I, I'll have to believe that it's true. When I was 2 years old, I had a nanny who took me walking around the neighborhood. And I get a little choked up when I talk about this. She took me into a Russian church that was having a service. And there was some unaccompanied choral music, my mother tells me. And I was 2 years old, by the way. And I came home and I said, Mom, I just heard the most beautiful music ever. And that was my first musical experience, just listening to Russian religious music, maybe that was the first thing that made me want to be a musician. I'm not sure. The other one, also from Bucharest, is that we have a fantastic hall in Bucharest. It's called the Athenaeum. And they had a family concert there every Sunday. It was the George Enesco Symphony and great soloists. And for us, it was like going to church. We got dressed up, and it was about a 20-minute walk from our house to the Athenaeum. And we went every Sunday afternoon, and there was always a crowd, waiting to get in. And I heard all the great Russian musicians when I was, 6, 7, 8 years old. I heard Oistrakh. I heard Richter, unbelievable. I still remember, he played a concerto. I don't remember the concerto, maybe Rachmaninoff second. But then he played an encore, and what happened in Bucharest is everybody went to the stage. So you're basically at Richter's feet. And I was right there, and he played. And it was this most unbelievable kind of just ethereal flow of notes, and I was sitting at Richter's feet listening to him play Schubert. So pretty unbelievable. So I had a very rich musical exposure when I was a kid. I'm trying to think of other, special things. Of course, my teacher Fleischer, when he made his return to playing with two hands, I think it was 1984. And, his hand was never really healed, but he was getting some kind of treatments, and it was fairly functional. He wanted to play Beethoven fourth, but it's just too pristine and too transparent. So he decided to play Franck symphonic variations. And then he played an encore. He played. It's on YouTube. And, the most divine purity. And, what I was talking about before, the economy of expression, that where it's profoundly moving, but it's also extremely dignified. There's absolutely no mannerism or no. And, that just remains one of the most incredible musical memories I have. I was in the hall, so it was extremely emotional for everybody. Yeah, maybe those are, I listen to, I'm a big jazz lover, and my favorite musician is Bill Evans. And I hear the same qualities, kind of economy of means, just beautiful expression without any exaggeration. So that's kind of, one of my aesthetics. It's very important to me.
Thank you so much for your beautiful stories. I think my last question would be, under this uncertain time period, what are some of the advice you could give your students or give to young musicians who are trying to make it in the profession?
Yes, advice. It's a difficult. I mean, it's always been difficult to be a musician. To think about how to, earn a living and to pay the rent and buy the food and so on. So those are, of course, important issues of survival. And so, when I was in school, there was no emphasis on any kind of career. development or thinking about, PR and that kind of thing. And I think that's changed quite a lot recently. So thinking about how to, it's a terrible word, how to market yourself.
Mm.
Um, these days, I think it's probably pretty important to be versatile, to be a, good accompanist, to be able to sight read well, to learn quickly, to be adaptable, um, so that you can take advantage of whatever opportunities come your way. Um, I think getting some experience in teaching early on, taking pedagogy and so on, because you're going to be teaching at some, everybody does. And it's not a compromise, it's an important part of what we do. So be practical. But I always tell my students, keep some kind of area that has nothing to do with business or with self-promotion. Uh, keep a keep an area somewhere that is pure,
Mhm.
which has to do with just your love for music. You're looking for truth, um, looking for you know channeling your creativity, and try not to think about those other things which are very important, and just you know keep a pure space in your heart for your work.
Mhm. Thank you very much for talking with me. It's been life affirming to listen to you talk about music. And I hope everything goes well this semester and then stay safe. And
Yeah, the same to you, Shiting, and lovely to talk to you.
yes,
It's a
thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.